Charlie Pellet, thank you so much with his eye on the markets for us, always keeping us honest. What would we do without Charlie Pellet? He'll be back in just a few to keep tabs on Wall Street today. It's not been great as we work our way up to the big debate tonight. Not that that's what everyone is trading on here, but the uncertainty around the policy proposals from Kamala Harris, probably a bit more than Donald Trump, a more known entity, is very real and something we're talking about today as we anticipate hopefully some more details from both, particularly on their economic proposals. Now, I know that Taylor Swift has been a big theme this year politically, culturally, but I want you to put the Eras Tour down, okay? Forget about Beyonce. What is that? What's the name of Beyonce's tour, James? Renaissance Tour? The Renaissance Tour, yeah. Because fresh off his tour of India and the subcontinent is Nathan Dean, Bloomberg Intelligence U.S. policy senior analyst. I'm not making this up. This guy is on an international tour ever since Kamala Harris went to the top of the ticket. The interest from our subscribers, from his clients, terminal subscribers like you and others around the world want to talk to Nathan Dean because nobody knows what's going to come next. We get to talk to him every week around here, and it's nice for you to stop by in Washington for a minute. Your poor family.
Thanks for having me.
What country are you city are you just back from?
I was in Toronto.
Toronto. I'm not making this up, right? No. How many speeches, how many sessions do you have scheduled since the change in the ticket?
I mean, like, I can't even count. But look, I mean, but the reason being is, to your point, I mean, people, I think, have an understanding where the Trump 2.0 president would be like.
Okay.
But the Kamala Harris administration is still somewhat of an enigma. I mean, really, you can say that as vice president, she's supported by President Biden's policies, but even then, we're still just trying to figure out exactly what a Harris presidency would look like. And so a lot of the client questions come about that.
Well, it's pretty hard to answer them when the campaign hasn't told you a lot, right?
Well, yes, but I mean, we can think of certain themes. I
Okay.
mean, obviously, if we think the Biden-era regulatory, regime, if you will, would continue on. Basel III Endgame could be an example of that. But, she's made a lot of talk about being tougher on consumer-facing sectors. Think of this price gouging talk that she did in a speech a couple of weeks ago. She wanted to go after bad actors. This is something that she did as Attorney General. So we've been looking at some of the consumer-facing sectors like retail, grocery stores, and so forth like that, and then trying to boil down, is there a real risk here? And for the most part, a lot of this is just that the campaign style, we don't actually think that risk will translate into true risk for equities because you either need an act of Congress, which is not easy, or by going after bad actors, you have to identify a company that is a bad actor. And if I were to get an equity, a publicly traded company CEO or investor relations on the phone, they'd say, no, we're not a bad actor. And so, I think it's just one of those things where it sounds great, on the campaign trail, and it may appeal to voters, but for those of us in the markets, it's pretty low risk.
Interesting that you point out it would take an act of Congress because much of what Donald Trump is proposing, specifically when it comes to tariffs, he could do on his own, right? Much of what Kamala Harris is proposing would essentially require a Democratic sweep of Capitol Hill.
That's right. I mean, so if you think of 2025 in phase one and phase two, phase one, if Trump wins, could be the executive order tariff argument. I would argue about 85% of executive orders are fancy ways of the president picking up the phone and saying to his or her staff, do something via legislation or regulation. But the power of the presidency is a lot more powerful when it comes to foreign policy and tariffs and so forth. So there is a real threat or opportunity, depending on who you are, of this tariff coming in the first half of next year. Then comes the tax argument, because the Trump-era tax cuts expire next year. That will take an act of Congress. If President Trump has the House and the Senate, he can use reconciliation, bypass the Democrats. Now, if you start with the assumption that the Republicans could potentially take the Senate, it's going to be a very difficult race for the Democrats to keep the Senate. They can certainly do it, but if the Republicans have the Senate, Kamala Harris as president is going to have to negotiate. So a lot of her campaign vows and so forth like that, if they're the legislative route, are going to have to be constricted, restrained, and potentially negotiated on with Republicans.
Before I keep going, by this is why we have Nathan Dean. Is this great? Before I keep going, do you expect additional policy details tonight, or that's like a comedy routine for you? It's a televised debate, and we're told it's style, not substance.
So I'm not expecting it, but I wouldn't be surprised either, because if you look over the weekend, President Trump, made a Truth Social point about supporting marijuana.
Yes.
In favor of the Safer Banking Act, reschedulization. something that, I wouldn't argue is very much at the, it's not something you normally would see presidential candidates talk about.
No,
but,
not the Republican.
But when you're talking about the margin of victory for this election is going to be in the tens of thousands, if not 100,000, every single issue counts. And so I wouldn't be surprised if you saw a mention of marijuana or a mention of some small issue just as in like as an appeal to try and get those individual voters, because every single voter counts in this election.
Well, it's really interesting you mention this, because we've talked about rescheduling a lot, and you've been ahead on a lot of the reporting on this. We can say now, I guess, that no matter who wins, rescheduling is on the agenda. Donald Trump is also backing safe banking, which we've also talked a lot about, allowing cannabis companies in states that have legalized to use actual banking services. Does his endorsement unlock this at last on Capitol Hill? It's passed the House like a half a dozen times or something.
So it certainly opens the door to it, but I wouldn't say it's a tier one issue. Like, I wouldn't expect that President Trump wins that come February of 2025, rescheduling is going to happen.
Okay.
Because remember, we've heard anecdotally and also through Bloomberg News reporting that there's a lot of staffers over at the DEA that aren't on board with this.
Right.
And it's one thing to say it in a campaign speech. It's another thing to move forward with it. I'm not saying that they wouldn't do it, but I'm just saying maybe it's not going to happen in the first 90 days or the first 100 days of the presidency. When it comes to the Safer Banking Act, the votes are there, but there's still just a little bit of naysayers in the Senate that, this bill would allow banks to service marijuana businesses. There's still a couple of folks in the Senate that need to get on board with this. They probably will still be there. And so then it becomes, what are they going to get in return? How do you negotiate this? Does it get attached to a funding bill? So I think the odds certainly would go up to 60 to 70% chances of the next Congress, but not something I want to jump and say, hey, it's going to happen in the first 100 days.
Enter Basel III. I don't know if I should have started with this, but we've been talking about all these issues for so long. This is just one big throwdown with Nathan Dean. Big deal here. Get your T-shirts out. We were talking about Basel III T-shirts. James says big 9% on the back. You'd want one of those, right?
I would always take one of those.
Yeah, we have to make one for Nathan too, James. This is important reporting. Katanga Johnson here at Bloomberg. Regulators will make extensive changes to their bank capital rules proposal by basically cutting the number in half, Nathan.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't just cut it in half. They also retreated way back from where it was originally proposed. So the original proposal was a 19% increase in capital requirements for the GSIBs, Bank of America, JP Morgan.
Yeah.
That's now 9%. But if you even look at the regional banks, originally it was 5 to 6% increase for banks above 100 billion in assets. Today, under the new plan, banks that are below 250 billion in assets actually get out. There's no more Basel III for them, except for a small provision related to unrealized gains and losses. So you're looking at a 0.5% increase in capital for those banks between 100 to 250 billion in assets. For the PNCs, the Truists, and the Capital Ones out there, you're now looking at 3 to 4%. And and we haven't even talked about like the market risk, the credit risk, and the operational risk provisions. Not to get too technical, there's a significant rollback for this plan. And, we think this proposal is going to come out in the next few weeks. Than the original. And so what they did is there was so much, I think, I don't want to say opposition. There was so much opposition amongst the banking industry, Republicans, and even moderate Democrats that this was, I think, the Fed's way of saying, don't sue us on this.
Yeah.
We're giving you essentially what you want, and we're going to move forward.
So the banks won. Is that the headline?
Well, I think the banks certainly got a lot of what they wanted, but when you see these comment letters come out, it's going to be a 60-day comment period. When you see the comment letters come out, don't be surprised from the banks that they even have a little bit more issues with the bank, with some of the risk weightings, because, there are folks out there that think that this rule doesn't exist. And that's one of the biggest questions we have is, even if the big banks are on board with this, there could be a smaller bank out there, say in the Fifth Circuit of Louisiana or Texas, and all of a sudden you file suit and it goes to the courts and goes to the Fifth Circuit. Could this rule even survive? So that's one of the questions of, will the banks actually be happy with this, or will the banks actually decide to move forward and sue? We just don't know. We're going to see it when the proposal comes out, and we'll see in those comment letters.
What does Trump think about this?
Well, that's
has he weighed in? Did he talk about that at the Economic Club? Or?
No, he hasn't weighed in on this, but this is something that President Trump could effectively stop if he decides to, because it's a 3-agency rule. It's the Fed, the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and the FDIC. Now, if President Trump wins, the folks at the Fed are still going to be there, but the OCC and the FDIC will likely flip. And the new acting comptroller of the OCC on day one could just say, I'm out of this. And next thing you know, you would have one of the 3 agencies say, no, we're not moving forward. And the Basel III endgame is effectively delayed, which is why I think some of the international jurisdictions like the UK have delayed their capital increases as a result.
Fascinating. This is why they're all calling Nathan Dean. Okay, last one on my agenda for you is Capitol Hill. We run out of money September 30th. Everyone says we can't shut down an election. No one's going to want to go home and talk about shutting down the government. But there's no solution right now. And the rule that passed committee last evening includes the SAVE Act, which is a non-starter for Democrats. So have we seen this movie before? We ping pong back and forth. Chuck Schumer jams the House, and then we kick the can and stay open.
We get really close to the deadline. The Senate does what they do. They send a bill over to the House. The House, just gets stuck.
Got no choice.
And then they sign it and they move on because nobody wants to shut a government down. We're at 20% odds. Nobody wants to shut
20%.
20%.
Yeah, so that is the conventional wisdom is wise in this case.
And we just don't think it's going to happen. And even if it were to happen, it would just be a day or two because, I don't think anybody wants to be seen, shutting the government down. And remember, Congress isn't here in October. They all have races that they need to run.
Right.
And they don't want to stick around when their opposition is out back home saying, so-and-so is in Washington not getting the job done. Mm-hmm. So I think most of it's going to shut down. Most of it's not going to shut down. They'll get a deal done and they'll kick the can.
Our last minute here, the idea of taxing unrealized capital gains, not likely to get much talk tonight. Maybe Donald Trump will bring it up. I don't know. Is that the deal breaker? Is that the poison pill for Wall Street when it comes to Kamala Harris?
It could be. Obviously, we saw Kamala Harris come out and say that she doesn't support moving to President Biden's position on that. I certainly...
On unrealized gains?
Yes.
Or just capital gains?
Well, I think that position is still evolving.
It is.
Right. We haven't really seen concrete language on that. Mm-hmm. And so I think you could see a mention of it, but we'll see.
What's the next city you're in?
Philly.
Philly. Hey, swing state. All right. Yeah. James has updated the T-shirt order. We're in good stead. Basel 3, 9%. We could make a fortune on this, James, I'm pretty sure. Buy the URL during the break. Nathan Dean, thank you. At Bloomberg Intelligence, our panel's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.